Argentina's inflation rate continued to slow in June, though it remains stubbornly high, even as the economy is widely believed to be in recession. Joining me down the line to discuss is Fiona Mackie. Fiona, Argentina's economy is receiving a great deal of international attention, but how would you describe investor sentiment towards the country at present?
It really depends on the time horizon you're looking at. There's actually a lot of optimism about the potential for Argentina as a growth market and as a location for FDI and even portfolio investment in the longer term. But that's dependent on a more market-friendly administration coming into power in 2016 and tackling Argentina's increasingly problematic economic distortions. And in the meantime, Argentina is facing huge challenges, and investor sentiment about prospects for this year and next year at least is pretty poor. Fiscal and monetary policy have been too expansionary for years, and at the same time government interventionism has deterred investment. And what we've seen is these problems have escalated for years, and now Argentina is facing a recession, rampant inflation, continued devaluation pressure. And on top of all that, the risk of default next week is creating huge market nervousness, at least about short-term prospects. So all in all, not so good.
Some people may think that when there's a new government, by the end of next year, things will move, but that will take time. There has been the suggestion the current officials are merely exercising their poker face. Can the Argentine economy, and indeed its people, afford to wait though?
Our benign baseline forecast assumes that the government will be able to muddle through, although there are clearly huge risks to this forecast. I would say it's important to note that the government has made some important policy changes, policy improvements. Monetary policy, for example, it's been sharpened dramatically to help bolster the reserves and gain fresh sources of dollar inflows. The government's also finally resolved a lot of its outstanding disputes with creditors and investors. For example, earlier this year it did a deal with Repsol to compensate the Spanish oil company following the expropriation of YPF in 2012. It also finally agreed a deal with Paris Club creditors dating back to the 2001 default to finally repay Paris Club creditors. So that's positive, but more needs to be done. On the macro side, fiscal policy is still expansionary and has to be reined in to address Argentina's competitiveness problems. And at the same time, you've got default looming on the horizon, and that's really thrown a spanner in the works in terms of the government's efforts to access fresh sources of dollars.
Now, should there be a default, it would likely weaken Argentina's peso currency, which has fallen 20% on the official rate so far this year, and fuel upside risks to inflation. Investors will likely opt for the US dollar and its safety. But could all of these goings-on bolster appetite for the blue dollar and black market activity even further?
I think so. It's not necessarily the case that a default would cause a maxi devaluation, because you have to bear in mind that the government, of course, it doesn't have access to international markets anyway, so it doesn't. A default scenario wouldn't necessarily impact on the sovereign straight away and in a direct sort of way. But default would have extremely negative consequences in terms of sentiment and also in terms of, for example, private sector access to trade finance and also some issuance by sub-sovereigns like the provinces or the city of Buenos Aires. So you can see that it would cause some real difficulties, and that has the potential, combined with concerns that were already in place. I mean, we're talking about problems that were evident last year and forced the government to make some policy changes and to go ahead with a mini devaluation at the start of this year. So in the background, apart from the default itself, you've got an economy that's in recession on the brink of a much deeper balance of payments crisis anyway.
And just lastly, Fiona, given everything that we have discussed, what is your outlook for the official peso?
Regardless of what happens with the default, we expect that more adjustment will be needed, bearing in mind that inflation is running at close to 40%, according to unofficial estimates. So really, you need to see more of a peso adjustment for Argentina to regain its external competitiveness. So we've seen the official peso has depreciated all in all by about 20% so far this year. We're saying that by the end of the year it will have to have fallen by 35%. And also that this adjustment process will continue out into next year. We're expecting a depreciation of about 20%, and 20% the year after that, and 10% the year after that. So this is a problem that's really got to be addressed in the long term, and it will take a long time.
Fiona, thank you. Viewers, I'll be back tomorrow with the week's last edition of Forecasts, so please do click back for that. See you then.